It's about more than those breathtaking sunrises. More than the future for those we care about. It's about seeing the whole picture and taking a stand. For over half a century, Club 20 has been the voice of Western Colorado.
Hello and welcome back to the Voices of the Western Slope podcast. I'm Brittany Dixon, your host and Club 20 Executive Director. Thanks for joining us for part 2 of our Legislative Session 101 podcast with former House Minority Leader Rose Pugliese. You mentioned how the rules go out the door at the end there. So let's talk about deadline pressures and kind of those last few days in the session dynamics. Because, I mean, if you're out there in the hallways, you're just watching things. And if you're following bills, jumping from this one to this one, or this one, it's been postponed, or, oh, I thought it was scheduled for today. You know, there's a lot of craziness. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners who follow politics on the Western Slope or even in Denver know that things speed up in the end. So let's talk about what happens when the clock is winding down. How does that all work? How does it influence how bills are prioritized, debated, and passed? And that rule book being thrown out the door, what do you mean by that?
Yes. So there are a lot of rules that are in place, except for when I started, it used to be the last 3 days of session. And then I want to say my first or second year, the majority said, no, we need more time to throw the rules out the window. So we're going to do the last 10 days of session. So in those last 10 days, the rules can be modified and sometimes not even used in order to expedite a bill going through the process. I should back up for a second. So it takes a minimum of 3 days for a bill to go through, right? Has to be introduced, has to have a hearing. Cannot have a hearing and do second reading on the same day. So that's 1 day. Introduction can go straight to committee. And that last 10-day craziness, you see a lot of that because in the beginning, it'll be introduced, but your bill could be sitting on the calendar for a good month before. And remember what I said about trying to bring your witnesses and the people that you want to testify on this bill and coordinating. There's not a lot of time for that in your last 10 days of session. So bills get introduced and they get introduced quickly, and then they can be right assigned to committee. So at 9 o'clock, they're introduced, and then 11 o'clock, you're presenting your bill. But it still has to go through that same process. Can't have second reading that same day, and you can't have third reading that same day. So that's where the 3 minimum days to get a bill through. So we go through the first day committees. Then clock strikes 12:01. I'm done. I'm being a little bit more for emphasis here, but at 12:01, your bill is ready to go to second reading, debated on the floor. And this is where you'll see from a minority perspective, and, I'm sure the majority has kind of their own perspective, but it's where, at least on the House side, we've seen a lot of the rules being used. We call it against us, right? Where they limit debate. They say, listen, we've got all these bills that we still need to get through, and we can't have Republicans talking for 12 hours on a bill. So we need you as the minority to maybe only speak for an hour or 2 hours. And so you'll see a lot of time limitations. I will say the last 10 days is really the most contentious.
Absolutely.
If I could wave my magic wand and be in the majority instead of the minority, for me, I think putting those heavier bills, the bills that really do require more debate and require more amendments, the ones that really have the most impact, I would say, I would love to see those all on the beginning of the calendar, right? Introduced earlier in the session where we have more time.
Right.
Versus kind of putting really controversial and pushing them through on the last, within that last 10 days when you don't have the time to debate and work on amendments in the same way. And I know we saw that my first year with property taxes. And then there was a ballot initiative, then there were special sessions. It really is not the best way to make policy. And we all learned that, right? And I think once we were able to actually come together, majority and the minority together, and work on property tax, again, not the perfect bill, but it did lower people's property taxes. And so we were able to do that in a very bipartisan way. So what I would say is the lesson to learn is, at least for me, and I can't say, I never had a bill that went through in that last month. I don't know that I've had one really truly, I'd have to think about it, about the last 10 days. But normally you're working through these bills and you need to give them the time that they need. And so sometimes we find really controversial bills are held till the end. And it's just not the way I would particularly care to do heavy policy. Speaking of rules, so House Rule 14, that's where it says the majority can limit debate. And when I say the majority, I mean, it's the chamber that can limit debate and you get to vote on it. But there's only 22 of us and you have to get to 33. So a lot of those things wind up getting passed. We've also seen, though, in this in my last session, not the special session, the regular session, where there were even some Democrats where Rule 14 was used on their bill. We, as the minority, would never vote generally to limit a person's ability to speak and debate on their bills. So that's when it gets a little bit more political and a little bit more contentious. And I would say from a leadership position, those last 10 days are probably the most stressful on both sides, right? A lot of negotiations are happening, a lot of compromise, trying to get your members' bills through, trying to get amendments that are substantive to make the bills better in a very shortened time frame.
And a lot of late nights, a lot of coffee.
You're very tired, and hopefully the snowstorms have subsided by May. So, but you never know. So I think those last 10 days, I would say on both sides are just, you really are truly are trying to do the best you can. But with that shortened time frame, it's a little bit hard. But it still has to go through that 3-day process. So it needs to be introduced and go through that process. And then at midnight on the 120th day, like you're done. So there is a hard stop. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about special session, which is a little bit different, but for the 120 days, you have a start date, you have an end date, and it ends at midnight. And you could go up to midnight of that day, but that's it. And so it's really important, at least for me, when I was in the legislature, it was really important to make sure I had the proper time to build the relationships, to vet the bills, to get community input, and sometimes you'll go to a committee hearing and there's things that you haven't thought about and now you have to rework your bill. So all that stuff takes time if you're going to make really good policy.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I definitely don't want to forget to mention, and it's off base a little bit, but a little bit of that legislative session 101 piece for folks. A bill is numbered, and you'll notice that there's a SB or an HB, and then a 2.5 for this last session. So next year it'll be a 2.6. So SB meaning Senate bill, and HB meaning House bill, and then the year that follows. If you are confused and kind of miss that part, or if somebody's referring to Bill 1223, generally speaking, if a bill has 4 numbers behind it, that's going to be coming from the House. And if a bill has 3 numbers coming behind it, that's going to be coming from the Senate. So that might help you guys kind of understand who you should be reaching out to, and when to reach out to them as well, because they'll keep their numbers as they move through the process, whether they're being considered in the House or in the Senate. Anything to add on that part before we move forward?
No, absolutely. No, that's really helpful, I think, for people to know. And the reason that the numbers are higher in the House is because there's just more of us and less in the Senate. And so that's why the numbers are higher. Yes. And, there's a lot of people sometimes will throw out a bill number and they'll be like 1225. And I'm like, 1225 in what year? In 2025, in 2024, in 2023. So sometimes when you're talking about bills, I would say specifying the year. So 23-1255 or 25 is really helpful as legislators are trying to navigate what your issue is and trying to find the bill that potentially caused an issue or needs to be resolved or just needs some tweaks. So just remember that those first 2 numbers, the year, can be almost as important as the last numbers.
Yeah, absolutely, because those numbers then get recycled the next year. So Senate Bill, or I guess, Senate Bill 25001 is completely different than Senate Bill 26001. And so I think making that distinction is very necessary as well. You're spot on with that. Okay, so getting back on track a little bit, we talked about what happened during the session, how committees work, those last final hours. Let's talk about after session, the governor's desk, how the bill goes there, the interim special session, and effective dates for bills. So you've mentioned this, the regular session ends, but that's not where the work ends, actually. So what's going on the rest of the year, and how do the laws actually take into effect? What happens during the interim? Are there committees, you mentioned some already, that continue going? Is there bill drafting happening and preparing for the next year? Kind of talk about those first steps after the session.
So after the session, let's talk about closing out the session.
Yeah.
If your bill gets passed, it goes to the governor's desk. doesn't mean it's going to get signed into law. And I know there was one bill I had, maybe two bills I had, where governor's office called me and said, hey, how important is this bill to you? Which I always think is really funny. Well, like I ran it and I worked it and it passed. So kind of important to me. But so they really want to understand, why are you bringing this bill? What's the motivation? Who does it affect? Hear what our concerns are, right? Because not everybody's going to love every bill every time, right? And
Absolutely.
so, and if the governor sees maybe some unintended consequences that he thinks the legislature didn't address, that may be something that we talk about. And so, thank goodness, both of mine, and in that instance, I was able to convince, and my co-sponsors, again, Democrats, right, were able to convince the governor these were important bills to move through the process, and then he signs them into law. But two important things to understand about bills, and there's a clause in every bill. It's whether it has a petition clause or not. A petition clause, and I, back in the day, ran one of the largest ballot initiatives in Colorado's history against a bill that had passed that we wanted repealed, and that was the national popular vote. And the reason we were able to do that, to petition the people, was that there was a petition clause that said, the people, if you don't like this bill, you all can come together and get the necessary signatures by petition to put it on the ballot to ask the people, the whole state, whether they agree that this bill should go into law or not. And so if it has a petition clause, and even if the governor signs the bill into law, doesn't mean it goes into effect right away, because there's this period of time where people can gather signatures and try to get it on the ballot. And then if there's not a petition clause, then it could go into effect right away. But check your bill, because a lot of bills, especially nowadays with all of the budget issues and crises that we're in, they don't go into effect right away. So It might pass in 2025, but it might not go into effect until 2027. And it could be January, it could be July. And so don't assume that just because a bill is signed into law that it is going into law tomorrow. And so I think that that's really important for people to note, whether the bill is going to affect now, if there's a petition clause, if there's a time gap, what does that look like? So, but yeah, and then if the governor does not like the bill, and there's a lot of bills he doesn't like, he can veto that bill. And we even saw this year, which was kind of different, a veto override, where if you're still in the legislature and the bill goes through the process and it goes to the governor's desk and he decides to veto it, the legislature still has an opportunity to override his veto. And so we saw a couple of those questions come forward this year, which was kind of different. Doesn't happen all the time. And so then it's up to the legislature to either override the veto or not. So anyway, and both chambers have to be able to do that. So if the Senate says, yes, we're going to veto, but the House says no, then the bill stands. Or the veto stands. So we saw some of that this year, which was kind of different.
Yeah. And speaking of different, I guess not for maybe these past few years, we've had a few special sessions. Maybe we could talk a little bit about special sessions. How does the call for a special session get determined? When do they occur? And how do they work differently than the regular session?
So like I said, in the Constitution, you have 120 days. You have a start date, an end date, and that's it. But sometimes the governor believes that the legislature still has unfinished business. And since I was elected in 2022, we had a special session. I think we had two my first year. And then there's been one, I want to say, just about every year. And it could be on a variety of topics. Property tax was a hot topic then. And because we were under such a time constraint to get it fixed, there had to be a special session because you can't wait for the January start date of the next session. And so the governor is able to call a special session at any time for a very specified purpose. It has to be very specific. And generally, he consults with the minority. But really, from my experience, it seems like it's very governor majority driven agenda. And then he sets out through a proclamation, this is the call. So I'm calling you all back to go do unfinished business. And it has to be on a very specific topic. And so he was able to do that. We had a special session in August around budget issues and AI, artificial intelligence, because there was unfinished business that needed to happen. And so that has to last at a minimum 3 days. Why 3 days? Well, because it has to go through the same process, right? So introduction, committee, can't be on the same day as second reading, can't be on the same day as third reading. So you need that 3 days. So at a minimum, so people will generally say, well, governor's calling a special session and you guys will be in session for 3 days. Here's the hard part. There's no real end time. So unlike the 120 days where you know when it starts and you know when it finishes and at midnight it's done, not necessarily for a special session. We've seen them go on, and we've seen them, go generally quickly. So, but a minimum of 3 days. I have yet to see a special session that really actually only lasted 3 days. I will say, in my experience, special session works best when when you kind of have a plan on what you want to accomplish, right? I think with property tax, when we were successful lowering it, it was because Republicans and Democrats came together, worked through, and even though amendments happened and lots more conversations happened, there was a great framework going into special session. Generally, when there's not a great framework, it just makes the session longer and a little bit more difficult. So I always think the best special sessions are the bipartisan ones.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the best bills, the best everything, typically being from both parties is really important because you get the different perspectives. And I know we're running short on time and I want to be respectful of your time, but for our listeners across the Western Slope, you hear a lot about the bills and laws and policies, but you might not know how to get it actually plugged into the process and participate in the process because it is the people's process. So how, from your perspective, what's the most effective way for citizens, local stakeholders to influence legislation? Is it early in the process? Should it be at the committee hearings? Is it, seeing them in town if they happen to be here over the weekend before you guys have the late hours? What's the best way for people to get involved?
Well, just for the record, Brittany did not ask me to plug Club 20, but I'm going to do that here. Getting involved in great organizations like Club 20, where you have shared voices and priorities, I think is incredibly important. There are organizations throughout the state that you can get involved in to be very passionate about issues, but I've been a Club 20 member for a long time, and I think it really is a great organization. So a couple of things. One, building those relationships with legislators. Start in your own hometown, right? If you don't know your own legislator, go take them to coffee. I used to love that when constituents would reach out, and I always made time for coffee because I think it's really important to get to know your constituents, to know what their issues are, but to help them engage in the process. And so build a relationship with your local legislators, Senate and House, and then branch out from there. And whether it's a West Slope issue and you want to get to know legislators on both sides of the aisle is generally important. Across the Western Slope, start building some relationships. Let them get to know you. And then you can actually, you really can have such an influence. I can't tell you how many people have influenced my legislation just by reaching out and building that relationship. And so building relationships, probably the most important thing you can do if you want to influence this process. And then after that, I would say, if you're not involved in a great organization like Club 20, although I generally recommend it, you can reach out to legislators, look at a calendar, find a committee that you're passionate about, whether that's agriculture, education. I mean, there's so many committees that have real life issues that are important to you, and just start tracking that committee and find out what kind of bills they're listening to. And then read some of those bills. They'll all be online. And you can participate in the process by either showing up at the Capitol, which is always great. I loved, and Brittany can attest to this, when you have your West Slope friends coming to your office at the Capitol. It is so incredible. And sometimes you just need that kind of West Slope love. So go love on your legislators, but also, being able to go down to the Capitol and build those relationships, really important. If you're not able to do that, though, we have the fabulous remote option, and that was great on the Western Slope. When I was a county commissioner, I utilized it a lot to be able to testify on committees. Sometimes these committee meetings can go until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And so being patient and waiting your turn and not giving up, also really important, but being remote. And yes, we do listen to remote as much as we do for people in the room. It still matters. And you could also send emails and letters. Sometimes we would even read them on the House floor. So those really can influence your legislators. Obviously, being there in person, being remote, sending a letter, get your voice heard. Really important to this legislative process because legislators need to hear, especially about the unintended consequences or how it affects you and your life and your family. And so being able to bring that voice is really important. And then I always say, if you can even just reach out to your legislator as you've developed these relationships and just give them some words of encouragement. It doesn't always have to be about a bill. sometimes it's just about a hard day. I know there were definitely some hard days on the floor where I would see a text pop up from a constituent or from some friends on the West Slope or in Southeast Colorado or throughout Colorado who would just say, hey, I'm watching you and you're doing a great job. So, those words of encouragement sounds like, it wouldn't be that big of a deal, but it really is. So I would say developing those relationships and supporting your people, even if you don't always agree, is really the best thing that we can do for all people in Colorado.
Yeah, absolutely. And I swear it's not a requirement to be on this podcast to plug Club 20. But our organization can be a great resource for you guys, our listeners, to get plugged in, to create those relationships so that you feel comfortable reaching out personally, because they do. They don't want to just hear from me and from our membership as a whole. They want to hear the real life impact of the things that they're passing in Denver are doing to you. It's better coming from, anything to do with agriculture is better coming from a person in a cowboy hat and boots than it is in somebody with a suit and tie that's there every day. They want to hear from you, the real people that are facing the impacts of their bills. So in closing, Rose, I just want to thank you for walking us through this often complex but absolutely vital legislative process here in Colorado. For many, it's a bit of a black box, and I think today you helped open up some of those doors. And for our listeners, whether you live on the Western Slope, the Front Range, or anywhere in Colorado, you have a voice and a role here. When you hear about pending legislation, consider reaching out to your representative, testifying at committees if possible. The remote option is absolutely incredible, and I use it often, or contacting local advocacy groups such as Club 20. So thank you again, Rose, for your time and insight. And I'm Brittany Dixon, and this has been the Voices of the Western Slope. Until next time, thanks, Rose.
Thank you.
Because our way of life is worth protecting. Join Club 20 today. Visit club20.org to learn how.